Tonight on Sleepless Mythology, we travel back to ancient Egypt, where the Nile flows steady, the sun bakes temple rooftops, and two gods find themselves in a quiet tug of war over the throne. This is the story of Set and Horus, a tale of patience, pride, and one surprisingly dramatic salad. Before we begin, remember to comment where you are and what time it is so we can see who's joining us from around the world. We love to see where you're tuning in from. Now close your eyes, sink into the covers, take a deep breath and release it, relaxing your face, shoulders, and the rest of your body. Let your thoughts slow, and let this very old tale carry you gently into slumber. What follows is a tale that ancient Egyptian priests probably didn't tell to children. It involves lettuce, yes, but not in a way that would improve your salad. First, you should understand that ancient Egyptian lettuce was nothing like our modern romaine. It was Lactica cereola, a bitter wild lettuce, tall and proud, growing up to 6 feet high with milky sap that flowed when its leaves were broken. The Egyptians saw this white sap as deeply symbolic, connected to life, fertility, and Min, the god of reproductive forces. It was associated with, well, let's just say it was a symbol of fertility and leave it at that. They carved images of this lettuce on temple walls, presented it in offerings, and wrote about it in medical texts. Enter Set, who was fuming about that boat race he lost to his nephew Horus in a challenge for the throne of Egypt. Set, still trying to prove his dominance, invited Horus to dinner, which, given family history, should have immediately raised suspicions. But Horus went anyway, because divine beings never learn. That invitation wasn't random. Set had watched his nephew's habits, noted his fondness for this plant, and planned this dinner party with all the careful malice of a scorpion choosing where to sting. The guest list was exclusive, just uncle and nephew, dining in Set's desert palace where the red sands matched the colour of his hair. The servants were dismissed. The table was set with care. Golden plates that caught the lamplight, wine cups carved from lapis lazuli, and the centrepiece, a platter of carefully prepared lettuce, each leaf arranged with artistic precision, each one harbouring Set's secret ingredient. Young Horus arrived dressed as befitted a claimant to Egypt's throne, golden collar gleaming, falcon headdress catching the light, eyes lined with kohl, one brown, one blue, but that's another story entirely. They reclined on cushions, making the small talk of gods, the flooding of the Nile this season, the quality of offerings at the temples, and the difficulty of finding good pyramid builders. All while Set watched Horus like a crocodile watches a drinking gazelle. When the lettuce was served, Set spoke of reconciliation, of ending their feud, of sharing power perhaps, all while urging Horus to eat the carefully doctored greens. But he had tampered with it first, in a way that would have horrified modern food safety inspectors. He then planned to use this tampering as evidence of his dominance over Horus. But Horus had learned caution. You don't grow up in the marshes hidden from a murderous uncle without developing some instincts. He noted how Set's eyes gleamed, how his smile showed too many teeth, how he watched each bite with far too much interest. Claiming a sudden urgent matter requiring his attention, Horus left the dinner party early, the magically compromised lettuce still churning in his stomach. Through the night he flew, in falcon form, wings beating against the desert air until he reached the delta marshes where Isis waited in her reed house. Already knowing something was wrong, mothers usually do, Isis, whose magic could unravel the schemes of gods and men, quickly discovered what Set had done. Her anger lit up the night sky, turned the river waters to steam, made crocodiles hide in their caves. But anger wasn't enough. Isis knew that in divine politics, embarrassment was a sharper weapon than mere violence. She taught her son a spell, ancient words of power that would turn Set's scheme against him, magic that would make the evidence point in a very different direction. Through the night they worked, mother and son weaving spells in the marshland, while ibises watched from their roosts and frogs fell silent in respect. They used gold dust and moon water, lotus petals and papyrus ash, creating a counterspell so clever that even Thoth, god of wisdom, would have taken notes. Horus managed to turn Set's plan against him. The gods were treated to yet another dramatic court presentation, with Set and Horus both claiming victory, while the scribes recording the proceedings probably wished they'd chosen different careers. Ra called an emergency council at the first rays of dawn, when complaints from both parties reached his solar boat as it began its daily journey. The great gods gathered, some still yawning, to hear this strange case. The divine court assembled in the Hall of Two Truths, where Ma'at's feather floated, where souls were usually judged. Now it would judge gods instead, while Thoth stood ready with reed pen and papyrus to record the proceedings. Set spoke first, outraged, claiming Horus had defiled his food and his hospitality, breaking sacred guest rites with magical mischief. His red face grew redder, desert storms brewing in his fierce eyes, but Horus stood serene, falcon eyes glinting with hidden amusement, as he suggested simple tests to prove his innocence. Behind him, Isis watched, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When divine magic was applied, when truth spells were cast, the results were unexpected. Set's own scheme had backfired. The evidence pointed to him, and several younger gods had to excuse themselves, trying not to laugh. The sun god rubbed his temples, looking rather pained as he listened to the details. These family feuds were aging him, making his daily sky journey feel twice as long, though he had to admit this one was rather clever. In the end, Ra declared that both parties were at fault. Set for his initial scheme, Horus for his counterplot, but Isis's magic had won the day, turning violation to victory, shame to triumph, in ways none could contest. Set stormed from the hall, thunder following his footsteps, while Horus maintained dignity, though his eyes danced with mirth. Isis allowed herself one small laugh. Thoth filled several scrolls, and Ra announced he needed a very long nap. The tale spread through Egypt, teaching several morals. Never underestimate a mother's magic, don't mess with someone's dinner, keep your scheme simple, and most importantly, be very, very careful when dining with enemies. This story entered temple lore, priests told it on special days, adding their own embellishments, until lettuce became associated with divine justice served cold, with clever victories, with mother's wisdom, and with the dangers of dinner parties. This contest, like many others, still didn't resolve the succession crisis, though it did ensure that later generations would never look at lettuce quite the same way again. This dinner party debacle changed the game entirely. Set's reputation suffered, not from the attempt itself, gods expected such schemes, but from being outsmarted by the very prey he'd stalked. Cunning beaten by counter-cunning. The other gods began to view young Horus differently. No longer just Isis's son, hidden in the marshes, but a player in his own right, who could match Set's tricks with schemes of his own, while maintaining royal dignity. Humiliated but not broken, Set changed his approach. If subtle plots failed, then direct challenge would serve. He proposed contests of strength, tests of endurance, competitions of skill to settle their claims. The divine council gathered at an obscenely early hour, even for immortal beings. In the Hall of Two Truths, as dawn painted the sky blood red, incense smoke coiled like serpents, sweet natron and myrrh mingling with lotus blossoms. The god's very breath made the torches flicker. Several minor gods stifled yawns, while Thoth muttered something about needing more coffee, though coffee wouldn't be invented for several thousand years. Ra presided, looking rather done with the whole inheritance dispute. 3 millennia of godly bickering can do that to a sun deity. His golden skin gleamed like a newly minted coin, though his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He rose from his throne, voice resonating like distant thunder. 3 contests shall end this strife. 3 challenges to prove your worth. 3 tests to determine who shall wear the crown of the 2 lands. The first, the Battle of Beasts. The Nile that morning was particularly scenic, as if the river itself had dressed up for the occasion. Fish gathered to watch, taking bets among themselves, while crocodiles claimed the premium viewing spots. Set's laugh echoed across the water as his form shifted first, skin turning grey as storm clouds, body swelling massive as a temple. Horus rolled his eyes before shifting shape himself. His hippo form was sleeker, more athletic looking, like he'd been working out at whatever cosmic gym young gods were members of. Their eyes blazed like coals, steam rising from their nostrils as they circled each other in the sacred waters. The clash shook the earth, their massive bodies meeting with the force of colliding stars. Blood turned the river pink. Their roars deafened crocodiles, sent birds wheeling in panic toward the safety of distant skies. The very reeds trembled. For 3 moons they fought, days blending into nights, neither yielding ground. Villages flooded from their waves. Fishermen told tales of giants, while the gods watched silently, counting each blow landed, each wound given and received. When finally they emerged, both bore proud scars. Both stood unbowed, both had proved their might. The water slowly cleared, but the Nile never forgot. Each year's flood carries echoes of their titanic struggle. Next came Contest the Second, the Sky Race. Their solar boats gleamed, crafted from morning light and afternoon glory. Set's vessel burned red like desert wind made solid, while Horus's craft shone with falcon feather iridescence, each sail woven from starlight. The race began at noon, because dramatic timing is everything in divine contests. Set immediately conjured storms, though several gods commented he might be overcompensating with all the lightning and thunder and swirling rainbow sandstorms. Horus wove through the chaos like a dancer through shadows, each tack and turn precise, each movement calculated. His wings caught storm winds, turned Set's weapons against him, while clouds parted before his prow like curtains before a king. Then came Set's mistake, a lightning bolt thrown wild, a gust that turned backward, a moment's loss of control. His beautiful vessel spiraled, trailing fire and thunder before plunging earthward like a falling star. The crash shook the desert, left a crater still visible in the western lands, where glass was born from sand in the heat of his descent. While overhead, Horus sailed on, his vessel scarred but sailing toward the finishing line. The third contest come next, the trial of truth. The Hall of Two Truths had been meticulously prepared for this final showdown. The cleaning staff had worked overtime, polishing every surface until the marble floors were practically mirrors, a decision they'd soon regret. Incense smoke drew patterns in the early morning light, though someone, probably Anubis, had overdone it with the myrrh. Ma'at's feather floated above its golden pedestal, gently rotating in ways that defied normal physics. It had been specially cleaned for the occasion, each barb gleaming with truth-detecting power and, some suspected, extra glitter. The divine audience arrived in their finest regalia, though Hathor's enormous headdress kept blocking everyone's view, leading to some passive-aggressive seat shuffling among the gods and a few pointed comments about practical ceremonial wear. Set strode forward first, his red hair practically crackling with barely contained storm energy. Several small dust devils followed in his wake, making the court scribes scramble to protect their papyrus from impromptu sandblasting. He placed his hand upon the floating feather, which twitched slightly as if unsure about this contact. A few spectators swore they saw the feather try to inch away, but it maintained its position. His voice boomed out, making the pillars shake and dislodging a family of very annoyed sacred ibises who had been nesting in the rafters. They expressed their displeasure in ways that required several servants with buckets. "I am chaos incarnate," Set declared proudly, while the feather vibrated like a tuning fork. The strength of the desert, the power of the storm. He listed his qualifications. Protected Ra's sunboat? Check. Created useful deserts? Check. Provided exciting weather for conversational purposes? Check. Made life interesting for absolutely everyone? Double check. Horus approached more subtly, though his entrance wasn't completely without drama. A shaft of sunlight mysteriously appeared to illuminate his path, leading to eye rolls from the less impressed deities. His hand touched the feather with surprising gentleness. The feather actually leaned in, like a cat being petted, which caused Set to mutter something about biased truth-detecting implements under his breath. The ungod spoke of balance and justice, of honouring tradition while embracing change. His speech was eloquent, though some suspected Isis had helped with the speech writing. He managed to reference his father 17 times, someone was counting, while maintaining eye contact with Ra so intensely that the sun god actually checked his collar for stains. Ra rose from his throne, summoning his most majestic "I'm so done with this" expression. The sun disk above his head flickered impressively, though those seated nearby swore they heard him whisper, "I'm getting too old for this." The air grew thick with divine tension. Even the incense smoke seemed to hold its breath. A few minor deities in the back row started taking bets on the outcome. Rhea's voice carried the weight of centuries and the weariness of endless family disputes. These contestants remind me of my own grandchildren. Several gods groaned, sensing a long story coming. The sun god stood silent for several long moments, golden light pooling around him like molten eternity. The assembled gods leaned forward, their divine breath held, creating possibly the first vacuum in recorded history. His eyes, deep as desert wells, swept across the hall, taking in every detail, Set's barely contained energy, lightning dancing in his hair. Horus's composed stance, though his fingers betrayed a youth's nervous energy. In all my countless years, I've never seen two beings more perfectly unsuited to share power, which is precisely why they must do exactly that. The confusion in the hall was practically tangible. Several gods checked their ears, while others wondered if Ra had finally succumbed to sunstroke. Thoth, however, smiled like someone getting the punchline first. "The Black Land needs order," Ra continued, his words weaving through the air like threads of destiny. "The fertile valley craves the stability of cycles, the predictable rhythm of flood and harvest." Here he turned to Horus, whose eyes shone with understanding and hope, the legacy of Osiris written in every line of his young face, every gracious movement of his royal bearing. "But the Red Land," Ra's voice grew stern, like the desert wind itself, "demands chaos and strength. The brutal beauty of storms, the fierce protection of our ancient borders, the wild dance of sand and sky." Set straightened at this, his fierce grin reflecting every lightning bolt he'd ever unleashed. The shadows in the hall seemed to deepen, as if paying homage to their master's pride. "Together," Ra declared, while manifesting a scroll that somehow looked both ancient and freshly written, "you shall create balance. Not the balance of compromise, but the balance of completion, like dawn meeting dusk." The air itself seemed to shift, as if reality was rearranging to accommodate this new order. A few minor deities sneezed, cosmic reorganization having that effect on divine sinuses. Ra proceeded to outline the most complex power-sharing agreement since the division of sky and earth. It included subsections about holiday rotation schedules, alternate Tuesdays for chaos, and very specific rules about who could smite whom and when. Isis in the audience allowed herself a small smile, though several gods swore they saw calculations running behind her eyes, already planning how to work this new arrangement to everyone's advantage. Nephthys dabbed at her eyes with a piece of cloud, proud of her husband's new role, while simultaneously planning to redecorate their desert palace with slightly less skulls and perhaps a few more comfortable sitting areas. Ra produced the crowns, woven from starlight and shadow, the white crown of Upper Egypt, pure as mountain snow, the red crown of Lower Egypt, rich as evening blood. They hung in the air, waiting for their bearers. Both gods stepped forward, their power rippling the air, creating small, temporary galaxies that winked out of existence before the scribes could document them properly, much to Thoth's visible annoyance. Ra lifted the white crown first, its surface catching light like fresh-fallen snow. The The crown settled on Horus like a blessing made manifest, though he had to adjust it slightly to the left, because even divine crowns sometimes need a bit of fashion-conscious tweaking. Isis beamed motherly approval. The red crown rose next, pulsing with the power of storm and sand. Set managed to resist his natural impulse to snatch it mid-air, showing remarkable restraint for a chaos deity. As the crown touched his brow, a crack of thunder rolled through the cloudless sky, making several minor gods jump in their seats. Set looked slightly sheepish, muttering something about involuntary weather reactions. The oaths were complex affairs, written on papyrus, that somehow existed in multiple dimensions. Thoth had outdone himself, including sub-clauses for everything from border disputes to proper festival etiquette. Horus swore first, his voice clear and strong. "I shall guard the Black Land, guide the floods of life, protect the people's peace." He managed to get through 17 pages of promises without a single stumble. Set's turn was more dramatic, each oath accompanied by small atmospheric effects. "I shall guard the Red Land," distant thunder rumbled. "Protect Egypt's borders," sand swirled. "Respect the new balance." Suspicious lightning flashed. Ra had to remind him twice that weather effects were not actually required for oath-taking, but everyone agreed they added a certain theatrical quality to the proceedings. The celebration that followed put mortal feast to shame. The wine flowed freely, quite literally in some cases, as several deities forgot about gravity's existence after their 5th cup of stellar vintage. Hathor, as goddess of celebration, took her duties very seriously, dancing through the air, while somehow managing to keep her enormous headdress from taking out any of the floating lanterns or lower-ranking deities. Thoth perched in a corner, frantically documenting everything in his eternal scrolls, though his hieroglyphs became increasingly creative as the evening wore on. Later scholars would puzzle over his interpretive spelling. It was Isis who started it, as mothers often do, telling tales of young Horus learning to transform. There was this one time when he first tried shifting, ended up half falcon, half hippo, couldn't fly or swim properly. Set, not to be outdone, launched into tales of his own early days. Did I ever tell you about the time I invented sandstorms? Complete accident, actually. Sneezed during a desert patrol that took weeks to find my way out. Ra, mellowed by wine and successful mediation, shared stories from the first time itself. You think creation was planned? Half of it was happy accidents. You should have seen my first attempt at platypuses. The stars wheeled overhead, occasionally rearranging themselves when certain gods gestured too enthusiastically during their stories. Astronomers would spend centuries trying to map constellations that were really just party damage. Minor deities formed impromptu singing groups, their harmonies literally creating new colours in the night sky. Several of these hues had to be officially banned the next morning. Through the millennia since, these tales were whispered in temples and taverns, carved on tomb walls and scratched on pottery shards. Each telling carried wisdom, like seeds scattered on fertile ground. They say the greatest truth learned that fateful day was that strength lies not in perfect similarity, but in complementary forces, like day needs night, like summer needs winter, like order needs chaos. Village elders would tell how set storms actually strengthened Horus's ordered lands, for without the chaos of wind and sand, the soil would grow weak, the people complacent, and in the wildest deserts, where Set's power raged, Horus's influence created oases of calm, proving that even the fiercest chaos sometimes needs a moment of peace. The scribes recorded how both gods grew stronger through their opposition, like reed against wind, like sword against whetstone. Their conflicts shaped them as water shapes stone, as fire shapes metal. Young priests learned that the hardest victories often come not from destroying one's opponent, but from learning to see how their strength might complement your own, like lock and key. The kingdom discovered that change, like the Nile, cannot be fully controlled, only guided with wisdom. Some years Set's chaos ruled more strongly. Some years Horus's order held greater sway. But in this endless dance between order and chaos, Egypt found its pulse, its eternal rhythm. Like breath moving in and breath moving out, like tides advancing and tides retreating. Ra's judgment taught that true leadership sees value in opposing forces. The wisest pharaohs learned to balance the voice of tradition and change, of preservation and growth, of stability and revolution. In their dual crown they wore this truth. Power shared is not power diminished, but power transformed, like two wings that together lift the bird higher than one ever could. Perhaps most importantly, the tale reminded all that even gods must learn to grow beyond their pride. Set, lord of chaos, learned to temper storms. Horus, master of order, learned to welcome change. In temple teachings, these truths were distilled into practical wisdom. The strongest foundation contains both stone and sand. The finest weapon bears both edge and balance. The greatest leaders know both peace and storm. Even now, they say, when storm meets sunrise, when desert meets river, when chaos meets order, you can hear echoes of that ancient compromise, that divine understanding, and that perfect imperfection. In the marketplace, merchants tell their children how business flourishes, when tradition and innovation dance together like Horus and Set's power, neither fully winning, neither fully losing. In fields along the Nile, farmers watch the sky and bless both forces. Horus's predictable floods, Set's cleansing storms. Knowing their crops need both ordered seasons and chaos's wild gifts. And so the greatest lesson of all was this, that opposition need not mean eternal enmity, that difference need not lead to destruction, that the finest music comes from different notes in harmony. In Egypt's own heart, this truth still beats: two lands, two crowns, two gods, two powers, forever separate and forever united, like dawn and dusk sharing the same sky. Each year when autumn comes, when the wind turns cool and stars shine clearer, the eldest storytellers gather to share these ancient truths, reminding all who listen that wisdom often comes from learning to embrace what we once fought against. And in quiet moments, when desert wind meets river mist, some say they can still hear the laughter of two gods who learned that their strength lay not in victory over each other, but in the space between them, where difference became dance and conflict became creation. Thus ends the tale of the greatest contest, where victory meant learning to share defeat, where power meant learning to yield, and where wisdom meant learning to see with both storm and sunrise in one's heart. Now let's continue with more Egyptian mythology. This one's about Thoth, and how he gambled time itself, resulting in 5 extra days of the year. Before time was properly ordered, the Egyptian calendar had only 360 days, which meant birthdays kept shifting awkwardly, and holiday planning was an absolute nightmare. The moon god Khonsu was particularly annoyed about this. Now, Nut, the sky goddess, had a rather pressing problem. She was pregnant with 5 children, but Ra had cursed her, declaring she couldn't give birth on any day of the year. Divine family drama at its finest. Thoth, being both the wisest and most clever of all the gods, decided to help Nut while simultaneously fixing the calendar issue. Though some suspected he just liked showing off. He approached Khonsu, the moon god who was quite fond of gambling, and proposed a game of Senet. The stakes? Nothing major, just a tiny fraction of Khonsu's own moonlight for each game won. What Khonsu didn't know, but probably should have guessed, was that Thoth had literally invented the game of Senet. Some say he spent centuries practicing alone, just waiting for the right moment. Over 70 games they played, each one more intense than the last. Thoth won enough moonlight to create 5 entire new days, while Khonsu developed what would later be known as a serious gambling problem. These 5 days existed outside the normal year, like a temporal loophole in Ra's curse. Nut could now give birth to her 5 children: Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. After winning 5 whole days from Khonsu, who really should have known better than to gamble with the god of mathematics, Thoth retreated to his library to figure out what to do with them. The library, as usual, was a mess of floating scrolls that kept rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking. A filing system that he insisted was perfectly logical, even though no one else could ever find anything in it. Osiris got the first day, naturally. Thoth arranged it when the Nile was feeling particularly musical, though honestly the river was showing off a bit that day. Every plant that sprouted stood up just a little straighter than usual, as if they knew they were being watched. The stars helpfully arranged themselves into a Died pillar, which was either a cosmic sign of significance, or possibly just stellar geometry having a good day. Horus's birthday was set for when daylight and moonlight balanced perfectly, a bit like a cosmic game of seesaw. The clouds, apparently feeling artistic, kept forming into wing shapes without any prompting. The morning dew turned out to have healing properties, which was a nice bonus feature Thoth hadn't actually planned for, but decided to take credit for anyway. Set's day was interesting. The desert winds, usually about as subtle as Set himself, decided to demonstrate they could actually dance instead of just blasting sand into everyone's eyes. The storms performed what could only be described as atmospheric choreography, though a few of them still needed dancing lessons. The red sand kept making patterns that even Thoth found slightly concerning, but he figured as long as nothing exploded it was probably fine. Isis got the day when magic was at its peak, which meant everything got a bit weird. Starlight kept falling like rain, which played havoc with astronomical calculations. The hieroglyphs developed a concerning habit of rearranging themselves into prophecies, mostly about what was for dinner, but occasionally something more substantial. Plants started gossiping with each other, though most of their conversations turned out to be complaints about the weather. Nephthis's day was when twilight decided to take its time, stretching out like a lazy cat. The misformed shapes that Thoth was pretty sure weren't covered in any of his geometry scrolls. Even the shadows got into the celebration, though their dancing was frankly embarrassing. Time itself got a bit wobbly around the edges, but since that technically made the day last longer, nobody complained. These became known as the Apagamenal days, 5 days of festivals outside of normal time, like a cosmic overtime period, where regular rules didn't quite apply, and magic ran stronger. Thoth's gambling scheme did more than just save Nut's children. It revolutionised Egyptian timekeeping. The priests were particularly delighted, as it meant they could finally schedule festivals without accidentally booking 2 major celebrations for the same day. Before this, there had been at least 3 incidents of trying to celebrate both the Festival of Drunkenness and the solemn Feast of Judgment simultaneously, with predictably chaotic results. The scribes incorporated these 5 days into their calculations with remarkable enthusiasm, though they had to create entirely new mathematical symbols just to deal with this temporal anomaly. Some of these symbols looked suspiciously like doodles of Thoth looking smug, but no one dared point this out. Khonsu's gambling defeat led to some interesting developments in Egyptian culture. The moon god established the first cosmic rehabilitation program for gods with gaming addictions, though attendance was somewhat spotty since time itself worked differently for immortal beings. I'll come to the next meeting took on a whole new meaning when you could technically delay it for a few centuries. Thoth, meanwhile, became the patron deity of both mathematicians and gamblers, which created some interesting theological discussions. Temple walls would often feature prayers that read suspiciously like probability calculations, and more than one priest was caught using sacred tablets to track betting odds during festival games. Even today, some say that during these 5 extra days, probability works a little differently. Mathematicians report their calculations coming out slightly weird, gamblers feel unexplainably lucky or unlucky, and somewhere, they say, Thoth is still chuckling about pulling off the greatest cosmic trick in history, winning 5 whole days in a game of Senate. The most amusing part? Some ancient texts suggest that Khonsu might have eventually figured out that Thoth had cheated, not at Senate itself, but by practicing for several centuries before challenging him. But by then, the calendar was established, the children were born, and changing it back would have required far too much paperwork, even by Egyptian administrative standards. Word travels fast in divine circles, especially when it involves someone successfully bending the rules of reality. It wasn't long before gods from other pantheons started showing up at Thoth's library, usually trying to look casual while browsing the advanced temporal mathematics section. Zeus arrived first, carried by an eagle that looked absolutely exhausted from flying between pantheons. "So," he said, leaning against a bookshelf that immediately rearranged itself to avoid his thunderbolt-singed chiton, "I hear you've been adding extra days to the year. Interesting concept. Very innovative." He tried to subtly pick up a scroll about celestial gambling, but dropped it when it started solving equations out loud. The Norse gods sent Odin, who actually had some intelligent questions about temporal manipulation, though everyone suspected he was really there to figure out if Thoth's library contained more knowledge than his. He and Thoth ended up having a rather intense discussion about the metaphysics of time, while two ravens and an ibis took notes. The ravens kept getting distracted by the floating mathematical symbols, leading to several pages of notes that were just shiny, written repeatedly. The Mesopotamian pantheon filed a formal complaint, arguing that they had invented calendars first, and therefore should have exclusive rights to temporal manipulation. Thoth responded with a 40-page proof demonstrating that technically he had invented calendars before time existed, so the question of first was metaphysically meaningless. The complaint was withdrawn after the third reader developed a headache trying to understand the mathematics involved. The Maya gods were actually quite impressed with the whole scheme, but suggested that if you're going to manipulate time, you might as well go big and create multiple interlocking calendar systems that would give astronomers headaches for millennia to come. Thoth took notes. Coyote showed up claiming he'd thought of it first, and had been planning to win some days in a game of chance himself. When asked why he hadn't done it yet, he launched into a complicated story involving 3 rabbits, a thunderbird, and what he swore was a very convincing explanation about why it wasn't technically procrastination if time didn't exist yet. Of all the gods who tried to replicate Thoth's temporal manipulation, Loki's attempt was perhaps the most spectacularly misguided. While others were trying to negotiate or create their own extra days, Loki figured it would be simpler to just steal one that already existed. He chose Tuesday, mainly because he thought nobody would miss it much. "It's not like it's Friday," he reasoned. His plan started reasonably enough. He disguised himself as a rather suspicious-looking sundial salesman and infiltrated Thoth's library. The disguise might have worked better if sundials had actually been invented yet, but Loki had never let anachronism stop him before. The problem with stealing time, as Loki soon discovered, is that it's rather difficult to shove a whole day into a sack. His first attempt resulted in him accidentally grabbing only the afternoon portion of Tuesday, which immediately tried to escape and caused every clock in existence to start running backwards for about 3 hours. Thoth, who had been watching this entire attempted theft with the weary expression of someone who deals with temporal mischief far too often, simply continued updating his inventory logs. He had long since learned that sometimes the best way to handle divine troublemakers was to let them tangle themselves up in their own schemes. The situation really got out of hand when Loki tried to stuff the morning and afternoon parts of Tuesday into the same bag. The 2 temporal fragments, quite unhappy about being forced together out of sequence, created what scholars would later call a temporal hiccup. Suddenly, everyone in the Nordic realms was experiencing morning and afternoon simultaneously, leading to a lot of very confused roosters, and at least one incident of someone trying to eat breakfast and dinner at the same time. This temporal disturbance caught the attention of Kronos, who sent a strongly worded letter to both Thoth and Odin about maintaining proper chronological order. The letter arrived 2 days before it was written, which rather undermined its message about temporal stability. Speaking of Loki, what follows is the tale of the greatest insult contest in history. Aegir, god of the sea and master brewer of divine mead, was one day hosting a feast that he hadn't actually wanted to host in the first place. The whole thing started when Thor came back from one of his giant hunting expeditions with an enormous cauldron. And by enormous, we mean deep enough to brew mead for every god in Asgard. The kind of cauldron that makes other cauldrons feel inadequate. This, of course, meant Aegir had run out of excuses for not hosting the gods. He'd been avoiding it for centuries, claiming his brewing equipment wasn't quite up to divine standards. It's not that Aegir didn't like company. It's just that hosting a feast for gods is rather like inviting hurricanes to a china shop. Something expensive is bound to get broken, usually by Thor after his fifth horn of mead. The preparations were a nightmare of logistics. His servants, Fimafeng and Eldir, had spent weeks preparing the hall, which sat at the bottom of the sea, making food delivery rather challenging. The walls were lined with shields that gleamed like fish scales, and the magical gold light was a particularly nice touch. Every god and goddess had been carefully invited except Loki, obviously, and the seating arrangement had been calculated with all the precision of a military campaign. You couldn't put Thor too close to Tyr because they'd start comparing warrior stories and break the furniture. Freya had to be kept away from Odin's wife Frigg because of that ongoing passive-aggressive feud about whose hall was more splendid. And absolutely no one wanted to sit near Bragi after he had had a few drinks and started reciting epic poetry. The evening started beautifully. The underwater hall shimmered like a pearl, with waves visible through the crystal walls creating patterns across the shields. Fimafeng was doing an exceptional job serving mead, managing to keep everyone's horns full without once getting caught in the crossfire of Thor's increasingly enthusiastic toasts to himself. The seating arrangement was working perfectly. Tyr was telling war stories to an appropriately appreciative audience at one end of the hall, while Thor was far enough away that his booming laughter only knocked over every third drinking horn instead of all of them. Bragi, the god of poetry, had been strategically placed near some particularly loud sea currents, muffling his occasional attempts to start a lengthy recitation about the time he saw a particularly impressive tree. Aegir was just starting to relax watching his magical golden light dance across the faces of contented gods, when he noticed the first bad sign. The sea outside the hall had gone suspiciously still, the kind of stillness that suggests something is about to go spectacularly wrong. Freya's cats, who had been contentedly sleeping near the hearth, somehow staying dry despite being underwater — divine cats have their ways — suddenly sat up and began hissing at the door. Odin's ravens shifted uneasily on their perches, exchanging looks that seemed to say, "Oh, here we go." That's when Loki appeared in the doorway, wearing the kind of smile that suggested he'd just figured out how to set water on fire and was willing to demonstrate. He looked around the hall with the air of a theatre critic at a particularly amateur production, taking in the careful seating arrangements, the pristine decorations, and poor Fimafeng's excellent service. "What a lovely party," he said, in a tone that clearly meant, "I can't wait to ruin this." Loki had never been one to let a little thing like, "You're not welcome here," or "We literally all hate you," stop him from attending a party. He stood in the doorway, firelight casting dramatic shadows across his face, wearing the smile that made even immortal beings check their mead for poison. His first act was to kill one of the servants, just right there in front of everyone, really set the tone for the evening. When called out on this rather significant breach of party etiquette, Loki decided that instead of apologising like a reasonable person, he would systematically insult every single divine being in attendance. Because apparently, if you're going to ruin a party, you might as well go all in. "Oh, Odin," he started, his voice carrying that special note of gleeful malice that suggested he'd been saving these insults up for centuries. "All father, they call you. All mother might be more accurate. What with all that feminine magic you practice? At least I was actually female when I gave birth." The hall went quiet enough to hear a pin drop, assuming anyone was foolish enough to drop pins around increasingly angry gods. Thor wasn't even there yet, but Loki had prepared material anyway. Remember that time mighty Thor hid in a giant's glove, curled up like a frightened mouse in a thumb-sized cavity? Very warrior-like, very masculine. I'm sure the skulls will sing of that for ages to come. The gods, not being known for their turn-the-other-cheek philosophy, began firing back. The air grew thick with accusations, each one more outrageous than the last. The magical golden light seemed to flicker with each verbal blow, casting strange shadows that danced across increasingly angry divine faces. "At least we don't spend years living as a female salmon," someone shouted from the back. "Says the god who needed help tying his own shoes," Loki shot back without missing a beat. The mead kept flowing, the insults got sharper, and the temperature in the hall rose with divine anger. Odin's ravens watched from the rafters, occasionally adding their own commentary, with particularly well-timed caws. Even the magical gold light seemed to be taking sides, casting unflattering shadows across whoever was being insulted at the moment. Poor Fimafeng really should have called in sick that day. He was just doing his job, efficiently refilling mead horns, tactfully pretending not to notice when Odin spilled his drink on his best cloak, and generally being the kind of servant that makes a feast run smoothly. He made the mistake of being just a bit too good at his job, receiving praise from the gods for his excellent service. Loki, who had never met a happy moment he couldn't ruin, took personal offence at this. Perhaps it was the way Fimafeng seemed to embody everything a good servant should be, unlike certain chaos gods who'd been kicked out of Odin's service for putting spiders in the mead. Perhaps it was just that Loki was having a bad millennium. Either way, Fimafeng's excellence at serving drinks became his death sentence. The murder itself was quick. A flash of a blade, a shocked silence, and then the sound of a mead horn dropping to the floor, which in the quiet hall seemed as loud as Thor's hammer striking an ice giant. For a moment everyone just stared, as if trying to process how they'd gone from pleasant divine feast to murder at dinner in the space of a heartbeat. Then the hall erupted. Several gods roared for him to get out at once, their voices making the crystal walls vibrate dangerously. They drove Loki from the hall with a combination of threats, thrown drinking horns, and what appeared to be a particularly angry lobster, the hazards of underwater feasting. But Loki, being Loki, didn't stay out. He waited just long enough for everyone to start thinking, well, at least that's over, before sauntering back in. The magical golden light seemed to dim slightly, as if even it was thinking, "Oh no, not again." "Did you miss me?" he asked, spreading his arms wide. "Because I've been outside thinking about all of you, and I've got some thoughts I'd like to share." Aegir, watching his perfect feast crumble like a sandcastle at high tide, reached for the strongest mead he had. Odin's ravens settled in for what promised to be quality entertainment. Freya's cat started taking bets on which god would try to murder Loki first. "Let's start with you, Odin," Loki said, his grin growing wider. "I've been meaning to ask about that time you spent 8 years as a milkmaid." Loki, standing in the middle of the hall like a performer on stage, was clearly enjoying himself far too much. The magical golden light seemed to follow him like a spotlight, though whether it was attracted to chaos or just had good theatrical instincts was unclear. "Oh, Odin," he continued, "mighty all-father, who practices cedar magic like a common Völva. Tell me, during those 8 years you spent wandering as a woman, milking cows and charming farmers, did you ever miss your masculinity? Or did you just add it to your collection of things you've sacrificed, along with your eye and your dignity?" Odin, to his credit, maintained his composure, though his remaining eye twitched dangerously. His ravens cawed something that sounded suspiciously like laughter. "And Freya," Loki spun dramatically, his shadow dancing across the walls, "the goddess who traded her favours for a pretty necklace. Though really, who am I to judge? At least you got jewellery. I got 8-legged horse pregnancy. Speaking of which..." "Don't you dare," Freya hissed, her cats arching their backs. "Your brother Freya! Tell me, how's married life with the giantess? Still enjoying that 9-day journey to visit your wife? I hear the honeymoon phase really lasts when you can only see each other once a month." Freya reached for his sword, then remembered he'd traded it for his marriage. Loki's grin grew even wider. And let's not forget Tyr, the bravest of the gods, who lost his hand to Fenrir. "Tell me, brave Tyr, do you ever miss waving hello? Oh, wait." At this point, Sif, Thor's wife, tried to defuse the situation by offering Loki a drink. This was, perhaps, not the wisest move. "Ah, Sif, still sporting that lovely golden hair the dwarves made after I shaved your head in your sleep. I must say it's an improvement. Though speaking of improvements, remember when Thor had to dress as a bride to get his hammer back? Now that was a makeover. The hall erupted in a mixture of outraged shouts and reluctant snickers. Even in divine company, it's hard not to laugh at the mental image of Thor in a wedding dress. That's when the thunder started. The crystal walls of the underwater hall vibrated with it. The magical golden light flickered nervously. Even Loki's grin faltered slightly. Thor had arrived. The thing about Thor's arrivals is that they're never subtle. The thunder got louder. The waves outside the crystal walls began churning like a giant's washing machine, and several drinking horns spontaneously spilled, though that might have just been nervous gods. Thor burst through the doorway like an angry thundercloud wearing armour, his red beard practically crackling with electricity. He had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the doorframe, which somewhat diminished the dramatic effect. But he made up for it by bellowing Loki's name loud enough to make the shields rattle on the walls. Loki responded cheerfully, as if greeting an old friend at the market rather than an enraged thunder god who looked ready to use him as a hammer-testing dummy. "We were just talking about you. Remember that time with the wedding dress? You know, you really should have gone with a different neckline. Boat necks are so much more flattering for your shoulder type." Thor's grip on Mjolnir tightened. A small storm cloud formed above his head, raining only on him, which, given they were already underwater, was a bit redundant, but definitely added to the atmosphere. "I will break every bone in your body," Thor growled, "and then I'll break them again after they heal." Now, Loki said, wagging his finger like a parent scolding a child. "Is that any way to talk at a feast? Besides, you'd have to catch me first, and we all remember how well that went when you couldn't even find your way out of a giant's glove. Tell me, was it cosy in there? Did you curl up for a little nap?" The small storm cloud above Thor's head developed lightning. Several gods prudently moved their drinking horns away from anything metallic. "At least I've never given birth to a horse," Thor shot back. "No, but you did drink so much of a giant's mead that the tide went out," Loki countered. "I hear they're still finding seashells in Jotunheim." The breaking point came when Loki, drunk on both mead and the sound of his own voice, decided to remind everyone about his role in Baldur's death. Up until then, the gods had been treating this like a particularly nasty dinner theatre. Uncomfortable, but ultimately entertainment. But bringing up Baldur, that was like throwing a lit torch into a mead barrel. "And you all act so high and mighty," Loki sneered, his previous playful tone turning venomous. "But let's not forget your precious Baldur. So beloved, so bright, so dead. And who made sure he stayed that way? Oh right, that was me. I even made sure to enjoy the show when they tried to bring him back." The magical golden light dimmed to almost nothing, as if trying to distance itself from what was about to happen. Even Loki's most ardent critics in the hall went silent. This wasn't fun anymore. Thor stopped mid-threat, his hammer half raised. Odin stood up slowly, his one eye gleaming with a terrible light. Frigg, Baldur's mother, let out a sound that made even the bravest warriors step back. That's when Loki realised he might have miscalculated. Just a bit. The gods moved as one. No more verbal sparring, no more trading insults. This was a hunt, and Loki was the prey. He tried to flee, of course, shape-shifting into a salmon and darting through a crack in the crystal walls into the ocean beyond. But the gods had been preparing for this moment. They'd crafted special nets, consulted prophecies, and most importantly, they knew exactly where Loki would go. They tracked him to a waterfall, where he'd been hiding out in salmon form, occasionally jumping up the falls just to show off. The thing about being a salmon, even a divine salmon with a gift for sarcasm, is that you're still basically a fish. The gods had come prepared with a net that even Loki's shape-shifting couldn't escape, crafted by the same dwarves who'd made Odin's spear and Thor's hammer. Apparently they had a special, annoying trickster god setting in their forge. Loki, in his fish form, leaped over the net the first time because of course he did. He even had time for a particularly smug flip in mid-air. The second time, Thor decided subtlety was overrated and simply threw Mjolnir into the water, stunning every fish in a 100-foot radius, including one particularly loudmouthed salmon who was in the middle of making a joke about Thor's aim. What followed was the kind of punishment that makes you wonder if the gods had been taking notes from horror stories. They captured Loki's two sons, Narfi and Vali. In a particularly twisted turn, they transformed Vali into a wolf, who then killed his brother Narfi. Because apparently this situation needed more family drama. Then, in what might be the grimmest arts and crafts project in mythological history, the gods took Narfi's entrails and turned them into iron-strong bonds. The message was pretty clear. This is what happens when you take family betrayal too far. They found a suitable cave, because every good punishment needs the right venue, and bound Loki to 3 sharp rocks. The bonds were tied to his shoulders, hips, and knees, which any torture expert will tell you is particularly uncomfortable. Above him, they placed a serpent. Not just any serpent, but one with venom so caustic it could burn even a god. The serpent was positioned perfectly to drip venom onto Loki's face. The only mercy, if you could call it that, was that Loki's wife Sigyn stayed with him, holding a bowl to catch the venom. But every time she had to empty the bowl, well, let's just say those moments made Loki regret every insult he'd ever thrown. The gods left him there, bound by his son's entrails, with only his wife and a very dedicated snake for company. The prophecies say he'll stay there until Ragnarok, when he'll break free and lead the forces of chaos against the gods, because if you're going to hold a grudge, you might as well make it an apocalyptic one. And Aegir's Hall? Well, he went back to his previous policy of politely declining to host divine feasts. Some things aren't worth the clean-up, even with magical golden light and excellent servants.